Welcome to A Grassland Minute. I am David Kraft with the Kansas Grazing Lands Coalition, and I'm here today with Doug Spencer, the State Grazing Land Specialist with NRCS and USDA out of Salina, Kansas. The Kansas Grazing Land Coalition's goal with these types of Grassland Minutes are to ask important questions for producers that may have the same questions related to managing their grasslands. A lot of times as conservationists, we talk about historic plant communities, or what are these native plant communities, how have they developed over time, and what are some of the key components of those, so functional groups, if you will. In most of our rangelands in Kansas, we have probably the strongest presence of herbaceous native grasses, and then we might have some shrub component in that, and in some situations maybe a woody component in as well. But what we have been seeing lately is maybe some of those non-native species now invading some of these rangeland areas, or a lot of these rangeland areas. And that's different from east to west in species. Like eastern red cedar seems to be prevalent really from the east part of the state all the way through maybe central to even bordering on some of the western parts of the state. Hedge and locust have been present for a long period of time. We've battled those. Russian olive is another one that seems to be somewhat prevalent in the western part of the state. So when we look at these plant communities, why is it important to really focus on, or maybe really address this from a historical perspective? Why do we want to keep these plant communities as close to historic as possible? And instead of promoting some of these non-natives into these areas, we want to keep them pure. What is the benefit of keeping this historic in nature?
So we have some of the most threatened, least protected landscapes in the world. There's been work that's been done that shows that, and so we've had significant loss of prairie landscapes. When I think of that loss of, what we're giving up, and so there's these ecosystem services that are part of that. And so these grass communities have an amazing ability to store carbon below ground. Whereas as woody components increase, we see that more stored above ground that could be lost, wildfire conditions, something else. The habitat, the birds are on a decline since the 70s in every group, but grasslands have the steepest loss. And so when you start thinking about available habitat, it's starting to connect those dots from that standpoint. Forage production from a standpoint is there's generational livelihoods of handing the ranch down to the next rancher and that next generation. And with this woody encroachment, or you mentioned about the species, what's really interesting is you start seeing what the seed sources are, and you'll know what's the threat around you. And so in some settings where you have hedge and locust, that's going to be a major pressure there. You have cedar trees and they're planted, then you have a seed source that maybe naturally wasn't there years and years ago. That's going to influence it. As we move from east to west then is wood encroachment, and that's actually taking that herbaceous community and displacing it with a woody. And so now woody becomes the driver, not that herbaceous, and there's ripple effects to these services because of that. And so drier environments, it doesn't happen as fast, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We sort of thought at one time there was sort of this threshold, like it's just not going to happen, it's too dry. It happens slower, but it can still happen. And so I think that's being aware of, that we see calorie repair. And you look at rural communities or landscaping, we can start seeing that one move out there. And it's interesting where even some of those trees, they might be native to the United States, but they're not native to Kansas. And so looking at some of those, going back to the this natural or historic community is never forgetting what really drove it to begin with. So we had fire in the landscape, and fairly frequent. We had herbivory, and so even not having herbivory in the landscape starts changing some of the services that are provided out there, and that's grazing and browsing. So we see an opportunity to bring some browsers into that landscape, and I think we've seen an interest with producers in the last few years. And of course, just the resiliency amazes me of these plant communities. The droughts they've had to gone through, and things where just they can adapt and change to just be really, resilient in that community. So I think that's what, when we're thinking about those, is that's what's getting displaced. Why do we want that? Is because those services, we see those ripple effects that are happening in the landscapes. And so again, that wildlife loss, the production loss, going back to that, actual values, using rangeland analysis platform information is just this idea of a yield gap. And so in the 1990, they kind of had, okay, here's our tree levels. If we were able to keep those from increasing, or that woody encroachment from taking over grasslands, we would have had this production potential. What happened then is woody plants increased, and so our herbaceous production went down, and that difference is called a yield gap. So we had a potential to grow this, we actually grew this because woody encroachments happened. That gap, 1.9 billion pounds of grass or herbaceous material. So when we think about that, is sure, that's forage available for an animal, but that's nesting cover for a grassland bird. That's forbs that a pollinator may be, need to be used. That's a change in fuel loading.
Yeah.
That now if that's eastern red cedar that's changed that, look at the fuel intensity that's changed. So I think those are the ripple effects. For those that understand hay bales, 1.6 million hay bales is what that volume is statewide.
Wow.